So just looking at some problems and solutions here, we have, it's clear that transnational trade has grown at a hugely ridiculous rate of late, and our capacity to regulate it has certainly not grown with it. And this is no different from other commodities, not simply illegal wildlife trade, but the response to this has been very poor. I've got a quote there from a law enforcement professional who highlights the most obvious thing here, is that enforcement results very often in a fine, not a punitive penalty. There's very rarely any prosecutions, and if there are, these are usually of actors low down the illegal trade chain. So poachers, couriers, truck drivers, people collecting the merchandise, rather than the people higher up in the trafficking network. This quote here is one of my favorite ones. It holds true just now, just as it did then. Enforcement across the entire trade chain needs to take place, not just on site where these animals are, although obviously that's crucial to keep these animals alive before it's obviously too late. And there are methods to improve the efficiency of patrolling, such as SMART, a software program which does just that. Crime scene forensics desperately need to improve, especially when you're bringing cases to court. However, it exclusive focus on anti-poaching, again, a bit of a sort of catch-all solution to everything that is applied. Very old model, necessary actions obviously, but it's not necessarily the only solution to deal with trafficking. Again, you're trying to protect a species which is in such high demand, with such a high value on its head, that you take 100 poachers out of the equation, there's many more coming in to fill that void. Also increased militarization, especially in insecure zones, politically, socially insecure areas, can actually have a very detrimental effect. You're suddenly creating an influx of arms which probably won't remain with the rangers or the people they're given to. So it can cause real further instability of those regions. Hugely important sensitization of law enforcement agencies along the whole of the trade chain, and trying to raise it up the agenda of law enforcement strategy. The one method of doing that is to identify these links and highlight these links between the existing priorities these enforcement agencies have, such as people trafficking, drug trafficking, and their links to wildlife crime. When I showed this picture to Monori yesterday, she almost ran screaming from the room, so I do apologize for flashing it up there. But I'm trying to make a point here that these are traffickers. The guy in the middle is the head of a wildlife trafficking syndicate, and those are his two close associates. You take a poacher out of the equation, this guy won't even feel it. You take one of these two guys out of the equation, he'll feel that. You don't build up the kind of trust you can see there and the kind of closeness you see there overnight. So if you want to have an impact, that's what you want to go after. You want to go after high-value targets. That will undermine the network at a very fundamental level. Replacing them is incredibly hard. And important thing to remember, you're never going to remove transnational organized crime for good. You can weaken syndicates. Syndicates are very good at morphing into another way of doing things. They're very fluid, and they can adapt to almost anything you throw at them. But you can seriously disrupt their operations if you engage in the right law enforcement activities, particularly intelligence-led enforcement, rather than reacting to incidents as they occur. This is very good at targeting serious and prolific offenders. Intelligence-led simply means that you are collating information, you are monitoring trafficking activity, and using that base of information to plan your strategies, plan your operations, and going after these kingpins, if you like. It can also predict emerging areas of criminality, which is a key thing. Just a moment here, I won't spend too long on this, but these are international agreements which a lot of countries have signed up to. Internationally, there are intergovernmental bodies that play a critical role in facilitating enforcement cooperation. Examples of these are Interpol, which is not a global police force, which is sometimes the impression, but more a coordinating body of other national police forces. World Customs Organization, another very important key player in wildlife trade enforcement, and ICWIC, the International Consortium on Crime. I skipped a section here at the top there. That's to highlight that nationally, these are the key elements of law enforcement infrastructure which exist already in place, and it's a matter of sensitizing those, such as customs, airports, CITES authorities as well, to extend their mandate from the priorities they currently have into wildlife crime for the reasons we've highlighted before. Sri Lanka, for example, has a very good Coast Guard system, currently focused on drug and people trafficking, I believe, but there's again potential for expanding that priority base and collaboration with others to monitor and provide intelligence into that sphere. Multilateral environmental agreements like ones covering transnational organized crime and corruption and financial protocols are very important in providing tools to enforcement agencies to collaborate to combat transnational criminals. These measures simply aren't being used, not routinely used anyway, against all wildlife crime. Sometimes it's a question of not knowing that they even exist. Sometimes there are impediments to their being activated, but certainly it's possible to overcome those with some focus on them. And without using all these tools in your arsenal, you're going to have a situation where trafficking remains a low-risk, high-reward activity, which is the opposite of what you want. In the Sri Lankan context, these are statements, conclusions from a think tank document report late last year. Engagement by Sri Lankan police, for example, has been very good in recent years, and they've been quite good at cooperating on counter-trafficking activities, not necessarily relating to wildlife crime. But the fear is that the increase in trade flow and expansion of ports and air traffic, as mentioned earlier, go beyond the screening capacities that Sri Lankan authorities currently have. If policies and capabilities remain as they are, it's not going to look good. It's not going to be good for certainly for transnational crime, in particular wildlife trafficking in this case. So there are some recommendations there to enhance the capacity that are currently there. I would stress that this isn't something unique to Sri Lanka. These are areas of growth, potential growth for a lot of countries, and if they don't engage in them, they're going to be in trouble. There's going to be much more wildlife trafficking happening than there currently is as globalization and trade continues to expand. Australia and New Zealand, for example, New Zealand just last month, I believe, the government shut down its anti-trafficking task force. No specific reason was really given. Budgetary constraints is the assumption, but this effectively renders the country almost powerless against wildlife trafficking. So these steps backwards and lack of sort of action aren't by any stretch of the imagination unique to Sri Lanka. This doesn't excuse them, obviously, but I wanted to highlight that it's not a Sri Lanka only problem or situation. A key thing again is to highlight the connection to southern India, where wildlife trafficking has a very strong base. You have thousands of vessels crossing, closer cooperation and coordination of operations between the two countries would certainly bring some benefits and some action in that regard. Deterrent sentencing is critically important. If you don't have deterrent sentencing, you're simply not going to have an impact on trafficking. Legislation very often isn't being used to the extent that it can be used. Maximum sentences aren't being given. Also what's called ancillary legislation. So we have primary legislation, which is wildlife trade legislation, and then other legislation which can also be brought in to make the sentence bigger, to make the penalties greater, such as forfeiture of assets and proceeds of crime. Corruption legislation is very often very strong. A lot of countries have anti-corruption legislation, and money laundering. So the solution there would be certainly sensitizing prosecutors and judges to the issue of wildlife trade. They're very often not even aware of it. They're barely aware of the legislation that covers it sometimes. And also perhaps providing sentencing guidelines is a very effective way of bringing not just raising awareness, but providing a sort of a template to work from in terms of what types of wildlife trafficking should empower them to do, to sentence to what extent and degree. Corruption. Most countries, like I said, have legislation covering it, but there's very few cases reported where government officials are brought to heel in this regard. And this is a huge, massive failing. Again, this is about deterrence. Criminals can only function in a climate where government complicity is part of the equation, certainly for large volumes of wildlife. In the case of Sri Lanka, the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index for a couple of years ago was 38 out of 100, so not looking good. And it's estimated to cost the Sri Lankan economy 100 billion rupees per year. There are implicated are public service officials, law enforcement agencies, military, field staff, very often manning protected areas. It's a very deep-rooted issue. And addressing them is very difficult. There is a structure. I'm not too aware of this, but from what I understand, is a commission to investigate allegations of bribery or corruption. I would question whether that's fit for purpose, whether it has the capacity to do its job, whether it has the resources to do its job, whether it has the diversity of staffing that it needs to do its job. I understand it's mostly police. So that's obviously a question for you guys to mull over. Improved security, scrutiny of legal transactions, key one, as mentioned earlier as well. Measures must be taken to address fraud and forgery of paperwork. There must be greater transparency of how regulations are applied to regulate trade. And domestic bans. Domestic bans facilitate enforcement. Again, Sri Lanka is very powerful in this regard in being very black and white about what it will and won't do as regards trade and wildlife. It sends a very clear message to consumers. There's no confusion in the marketplace what is and isn't legal. It closes that legal loophole that traffickers can jump through. And also it allows for demand reduction measures to take root. If you have a climate where the government is effectively saying through legislation that you can trade in something, then a bunch of NGOs coming along and trying to institute demand reduction efforts just isn't going to compare to that, and it won't function effectively. Domestic bans also choke trafficking, and also the last thing there, CITES is, as I'll speak shortly about, CITES is a regulation which covers international trade, not national trade, but increasingly seems to be recognizing the link between national trade and international trade. So in the case of tigers, it has said that the breeding of tigers in captivity should not take place, because it recognizes that those items, products and parts of tigers go into illegal trade and have an impact on wild tigers. And recently at the last CITES meeting also, there was a recommendation for domestic markets in ivory to close down, which is a key measure that CITES has passed recently. So jumping on to CITES, the green countries there are the ones which are members of CITES, called parties. Sri Lanka joined in 1979, and it's, as you're probably aware, going to host the next conference of parties in 2019. There are currently around 5,600 species of animal and over 30,000 species of plant protected under CITES. So, just to give you a basic outline of CITES, it's a mechanism to regulate rather than ban international trade. It bans only apply to species on Appendix 1. So there are two main appendices. Appendix 1 is a ban in trade. Appendix 2 species aren't judged to be necessarily threatened with extinction at the time, but they may become so unless regulated. So in that case, they're put in Appendix 2. So it's on a kind of watch list, and paperwork is produced to trade in those Appendix 2 species, so that's how they become monitored. Certainly, again, I would stress this is about regulating trade. This isn't about banning trade. So the increase in recorded transactions in that graph highlights that trade is ongoing and also very healthy in wildlife. It only applies to species in trade which get listed, so it's not a blanket list of threatened species. In fact, a species doesn't even need to be threatened to be on a CITES appendix. It can simply be heavily implicated in trade. Species can move between these two appendices. They can be species which aren't on them can be added, and they can also be removed. It also, key thing here, it also only applies to commercial trade. So commercial trade is defined as trade whose purpose is to obtain economic benefit. It doesn't apply to all trade. So you have a recent statement by a deputy minister in Sri Lanka talking about selling elephants and sending them abroad. That simply isn't allowed. It's not possible to do that. However, zoos aren't regarded as commercial entities, which means that technically speaking, if Sri Lanka wanted to, it could export an elephant to every single zoo in the world tomorrow, and it would have nothing to do with CITES. It's totally within its rights to do that. CITES doesn't stop countries adopting stronger measures, so it's not a replacement. CITES is not a replacement for national legislation. It's simply a common framework under which parties can operate on trade regulation. Species not listed. If Sri Lanka wanted to protect a species from trade which wasn't protected under CITES, it could certainly do that. The same goes for Appendix 2 as well. It could, if CITES put a species on Appendix 2, it could decide that actually it was going to ban it outright and do what's called adopt stricter domestic measures on that species. CITES is legally binding, so parties to CITES have to implement the convention and abide by its decisions. And there are provisions for sanctions. So if countries do not enact or do not act on the mechanisms and the measures which CITES has agreed on, there are provisions for sanctions. Worst case scenario, they get kicked out of CITES and they can't trade with other parties. The last one is probably one of the most important ones from my perspective. Having a species on CITES is not a final solution to illegal trade. It's actually probably the start of the road. You first of all have to amend national regulations to adopt the protection of that species as reflected under CITES, and then you have to enforce those regulations. So this is very often the failing. Job done, go home. That's not the case at all. That's when the work begins. There was a case of earlier this year. We had all 8 species of pangolins, 4 in Asia, 4 in Africa, being protected and put on Appendix 1 of CITES. That was in October in Johannesburg. And then in the very start of the year, there were 4 seizures and 14 tons of pangolin scales were seized. So highlights the importance of enforcement there. Endemics, obviously, that's something which countries are within their rights to propose for CITES listing, but it's down to the country. It's not something that is necessarily going to be adopted by other parties. It needs to be something which is put forward by the country in question. I'd encourage you to do as I've done here, as reflected in this snapshot of the screen. This is a publicly available database on the CITES website. That's the link there at the top. This is a very powerful, potentially powerful database. Effectively, one of the requirements under CITES is that parties send in trade data, so the imports and exports that they've carried out within a given year. Every country needs to do that, so when you're talking about 183 countries, or that's quite an amount of data, so that's quite an important source of information. So if you guys wanted to check what Sri Lanka was trading in, you simply have to jump on here, put in the variables of year, the exporting countries, the importing countries, and various other variables there. You can even search by species, and it will tell you exactly what you want to know. So just to summarize some recommendations, the key things here are engagement by national agencies, international counterparts and agreements, infrastructure, existing infrastructure, be it national agencies, enforcement agencies, need to extend their mandate into wildlife crime and expand to meet anticipated needs. Enforcement needs to be intelligence-led and go after high-value targets. National bans strengthen enforcement, to promote demand reduction, and commercial breeding of threatened species is certainly something to consider phasing out when it's not already done so. So some ideas for you, some discussion points perhaps for you guys who live here and whose wildlife is potentially being traded or is being threatened by wildlife trafficking. I'd encourage you to apply critical thinking, to not simply adopt measures which have been done before, to question, analyze, and then apply and support solutions which address the gaps that you find and go to the heart of the problem. Being mindful, whether you're in the field, whether you're in a pet shop or you're online, be aware that something you see, something being collected from the bush, may be illicit, may not be, but it's always worth bearing that in mind and reporting it. If it's nothing, then it's nothing. If someone has a permit to collect something, then all well and good. And that also serves to highlight that this is increasingly becoming an issue for the citizens of this country, and it encourages the enforcement, and directly encourages enforcement agencies to look at this issue. Community engagement, they're also a source of information in terms of potential trafficking that might be taking place. They're a key stakeholder, obviously, being rural communities, so we need their support to address this issue. You have a very sound basis to work from. The Flora and Fauna Protection Ordinance is a very strong piece of legislation in its own right, and Sri Lanka has historically adopted a very protectionist policy to its wildlife. That's something to be encouraged, that's something to build on and make it even stronger. I'd encourage you to collaborate with government and government agencies, support them to move in the direction of some of the recommendations and some of the thoughts I've presented today, and provide your technical expertise when required to do so. Sri Lanka is certainly at one of those pivotal points now, which we've seen before in other countries, where this is an opportunity now to tackle this issue. Based on current knowledge, it's certainly an issue which is growing for the country. Wildlife trafficking is certainly happening here. To what extent, we don't know, simply because it's not being monitored effectively. So get onto this now, before it gets too late. And you certainly have the mandate. I've only became aware of this a couple of days ago, I believe. In your constitution, it's the duty of every person in Sri Lanka to protect nature and conserve its riches. On that note, I thank you.